The rain had stopped, but the ground at the edge of the Springfield cemetery remained soft and dark. Nancy stood between the two fresh mounds of earth, her boots sinking slightly into the mud. She was 6 years old, and the silence of the graveyard felt heavier than the sky above. In her small hands, she gripped the ragdoll, her knuckles white against the frayed fabric. The dirt was still damp, smelling of wet minerals and decay. She did not cry. She watched a single drop of water slide down. The wind shifted, rustling the dry grass behind her, but she did not turn. She looked down at the mounds. There was no one else on the hill. The path leading back to the village was empty, and the trees stood like jagged teeth. She knelt, pressed her palm into the cold, wet soil, and felt the earth settle. She was entirely alone. Nancy turned away from the graves and began the long walk back toward the village. The path was narrow, packed hard by years of foot traffic. As she approached the first row of houses, the movement in the street stopped. A woman carrying a basket of laundry froze, her eyes locking onto Nancy before darting away. She reached out, grabbed her young son by the wrist, and pulled him behind her skirts. The woman's hand moved in a quick, sharp motion across her chest, a ritual of protection. Other villagers followed suit. They did not speak, but their actions were loud. They stepped off the path, creating a wide, empty circle around her as she passed. A man leaning against a fence post turned his back, staring intently at a piece of wood in his hands until she was well past. They whispered, the sound like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "The cursed child," one muttered, the words carrying clearly in the still air. They blamed her for the accident, for the empty house, for the sudden silence that had fallen over the village. Nancy kept her gaze fixed on the ground, her boots crunching against the gravel. She did not look up, she did not stop. She walked until the village houses thinned. The village, well, sat at the edge of the woods, a stone structure choked with moss. Behind it stood a lean-to shed, a structure of rotting timber and rusted sheet metal that leaned precariously against the slope. Nancy walked to the door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and stagnant water. A single beam of light cut through a hole in the roof, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the dark. She dropped her small bundle onto the dirt floor and knelt. The walls were thin, offering no protection from the wind. She spent the first night huddled in the corner, listening to the rhythmic drip of water. By morning, she learned the pattern of the village. Neighbors would approach the well, leave a crust of bread or a bruised apple, and walk away. They feared her shadow, so they left their offerings at a distance. She waited until the sound of their footsteps faded before she moved. She crept out, snatched the food, and retreated into the darkness. She ate in silence, the taste of stale bread the only constant. The seasons bled into one another. Summer heat turned the shed into a furnace, and winter frost coated the interior walls in a thin layer of ice. Nancy grew taller, her reach extending to the high rafters where she stored her meager supplies. She marked the passage of time by scratching lines into the wooden support beam near the door. The first year had 10 marks, the 5th year had 50. Her movements became efficient, stripped of all wasted energy. She spent hours sitting by the threshold, watching the sun track across the sky. The village remained a distant, silent entity. People still came to the well, But the offerings changed, sometimes a bowl of thin soup, sometimes a handful of dried grain. She watched them from the shadows, her eyes tracking their movements with clinical precision. She learned to read the rhythm of the road, the way the dust kicked up when a cart approached, and the specific sound of hooves on the hard-packed earth. She stood at the edge of the shed every evening, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed on the horizon line where the sky met the dry, cracked fields. The monotony of the road required a new focus. Nancy began to scavenge the perimeter of the village dump, dragging rusted iron and tangled wire back to the shed. She spent hours in the dim light, sorting through the debris with calloused fingers. One afternoon, she unearthed a heavy circular gear half buried in the mud. She wiped the grit away, revealing teeth worn smooth by time. She brought it to the shed, set it on a flat stone, and began to study how it locked into the frame of her door. She used a sharp shard of flint to scrape away the rust, then applied a drop of rendered fat to the pivot point. The metal groaned, bit into the wood, and held. She repeated the process with a broken latch, bending a piece of scrap metal until it snapped into place with a sharp, satisfying click. Her hands grew steady, moving with a precision that ignored the cold. She stopped looking at the horizon for a moment, turning her attention instead to the physics of the objects in her palm. She learned that every mechanism had a secret, a point of tension where it either held or failed. By the time the sun dipped below the trees, she had transformed the shed from a hollow shell into a series of functional, interlocking parts. She tested the door, listening to the metal slide against metal, and for the first time, she felt the weight of her own agency. The afternoon heat shimmered above the dry road, distorting the horizon into a wavering line of light. Nancy sat on the dirt floor of her shed, her fingers working a piece of wire into a tight coil. The silence of the plains was absolute, broken only by the occasional snap of a dry twig. Then, the ground beneath her palms shifted. It was a low, rhythmic thrumming that pulsed through the packed earth, vibrating against her knees. She froze, the wire held midair. The sound grew, shifting from a dull tremor into a mechanical roar that tore through the stillness. A shape emerged from the heat haze, dark and polished, moving faster than any cart or horse. It was a machine, sleek and black, cutting through the red dust like a blade. As it neared the shed, the steady roar floated. The engine coughed, a violent metallic hacking sound that echoed off the wooden walls. The vehicle lurched, its momentum dying as it rolled to a stop just feet from her door. The tires sank slightly into the soft dirt. The engine did not simply stop. It surrendered with a sharp, piercing hiss that cut through the stagnant afternoon air. Nancy stood up, her boots pressing into the loose dirt, and watched as a thick grey plume erupted from the seam of the hood. It was not the clean steam of a radiator, but a heavy, acrid cloud that smelled of scorched rubber and burnt oil. The smoke billowed outward, curling around the front of the sedan like a living thing, thick enough to sting the eyes and coat the back of the throat. Nancy took a step back, shielding her face with her forearm as the heat radiated from the metal frame. The cloud expanded, swallowing the front of the vehicle and drifting toward the shed, turning the bright daylight into a hazy, suffocating grey. She held her breath, waiting for the hiss to subside, but the engine continued to groan, popping and clicking as the metal contracted in the intense heat. She stood frozen at the threshold, watching the machine struggle against its own internal failure, the silence of the plains now replaced by the rhythmic ticking of cooling steel. The grey haze finally drifted away, caught by a sudden gust of wind that scoured the plains. The driver's side door of the sedan groaned on its hinges, swinging open to reveal the interior. A man stepped out, his boots sinking into the dry red earth. He stood for a moment, swaying slightly as if the ground itself were unstable. He was an elderly figure, his presence jarringly out of place against the backdrop of the lean-to and the barren, sun-scorched horizon. His movements were slow, deliberate, and heavy with a weariness that seemed to radiate from his very bone. He reached back into the vehicle to steady himself, his fingers gripping the frame with white-knuckled intensity. His face was a map of deep-etched lines, the skin drawn tight across his cheekbones, his eyes clouded with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He did not look at the shed or at Nancy. He looked at the ground, his chest rising and falling in shallow, jagged breaths. He was a man, accustomed to command, now reduced to the simple, desperate task of remaining upright in the heat. The man's composure shattered in an instant. His knees buckled, the rigid posture he had maintained just seconds ago vanishing as his center of gravity shifted violently. He lurched forward, his hands clawing at the air, before finding purchase on the hot metal of the hood. A low, guttural sound escaped his throat, a sharp intake of air that failed to reach his lungs. He pressed his palm hard against his chest, his fingers digging into the fabric as if trying to force his heart to resume its rhythm. His face turned a pale, waxy grey, the skin glistening with a sudden sheen of cold sweat despite the sweltering heat of the afternoon. He tried to straighten up, but his muscles betrayed him, locking in a spasm of agony. He slid downward, his back scraping against the sedan, his head lolling back until it hit the metal with a dull thud. His breath came in ragged, wet gasps that rattled in his chest, each one shallower than the last. He slumped fully against the hood, his eyes rolling back, his grip on his chest tightening until his knuckles turned white. Nancy watched from the threshold of her shed. The village was silent, the neighbors hidden behind their shutters, but she did not look toward them. She looked at the man. His gasping breaths were audible even from 20 paces away. She turned back into the shadows of the lean-to and reached for the heavy, rusted toolbox she kept tucked beneath her cot. The metal handle bit into her palm, cold and rough. With her other hand, she gripped the handle of a wooden bucket, the water inside sloshing rhythmically. She stepped out into the blinding glare of the afternoon sun. The dust kicked up by her boots settled on her skin, but she did not slow her pace. She walked past the well, the site of so many whispered insults, and moved directly toward the sedan. She did not hesitate. She reached the side of the vehicle, the heat radiating from the hood, stinging her face. She set the bucket down with a sharp thud. She dropped the toolbox beside it, the metallic clang echoing. She knelt in the dirt, her eyes fixed on the man, and placed a steadying hand on the metal. She was ready. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the plains in a bruised purple twilight. Nancy struck a match, the flame flaring bright before she shielded it and lit the kerosene lamp. She hung it from the raised hood, the yellow light casting long, dancing shadows across the engine block. The heat from the metal was still intense, radiating outward in waves that distorted the air. She unscrewed the radiator cap, the hiss of escaping steam sharp and sudden. She did not flinch. Her hands moved with a practiced, steady rhythm, reaching into the dark recesses of the machinery. The engine was a labyrinth of grease, rust, and stubborn bolts that refused to turn. She gripped her wrench, applied pressure, and felt the metal groan under the strain. Her knuckles whitened. The bolt gave way with a sudden metallic snap that echoed across the empty road. She wiped a smear of black oil from her forehead, leaving a dark streak across her skin, and reached for the next component. This was not a task of brute force, but of patience and geometry. She mapped the engine in her mind, tracing the flow of fuel and the path of the spark. The night air grew cold, but she remained motionless, her focus narrowing, until the entire world existed only within the confines of the engine bay. She was no longer the girl from the village. She was an extension of the machine itself. Nancy pulled the first spark plug. The porcelain cracked and coated in thick carbonized soot. She scraped the electrode clean with a small file, the rasping sound rhythmic and steady against the quiet night. She blew away the debris, her breath sharp and controlled, then threaded it back into the cylinder head with precise, delicate turns. She moved to the drive belts, her fingers tracing the cracked rubber surface. They were brittle, stiff with age and heat. She loosened the tensioner bolt, the metal screeching in protest, and worked the old belt off the pulley. Her hands were stained deep black, the oil seeping into the lines of her palms, but she did not pause to wipe them. She reached for the replacement, sliding it over the grooved wheels with a firm, practiced shove. The tensioner tightened, the belt snapping into place with a dull thud. She checked the alignment, her eyes scanning the pulleys for the slightest wobble. She repeated the process for every connection, her movements becoming a loop of reach, grip, and turn. The world outside the hood ceased to exist. She tightened the final casing, the metal clicking into place, and stood back to survey the assembly. The elderly man sat propped against the sedan, his breathing shallow, yet his eyes never left the girl. He watched the way she moved, not with the frantic energy of a desperate child, but with the calculated economy of a seasoned mechanic. He traced the movement of her hands, noting the thick, hardened calluses that mapped a life of relentless manual labor. Every time she reached for a tool, her posture remained rigid, a spine of iron that refused to sag under the weight of the long hours. He saw the way she braced her feet against the uneven dirt, grounding herself with an instinctive, unbreakable stability. She did not look at him. She did not seek approval or wait for a word of encouragement. She simply worked, her focus a singular, piercing force that ignored the cold night. He shifted his weight, a sharp pain lancing through his chest, but he bit his lip and stayed still. He was a man who had built an empire on hidden value. He studied her steady hands, the way she wiped grease from her brow without breaking her rhythm, and realized he was watching a survivor. The horizon began to bleed a pale, bruised purple as the first light of dawn filtered through the gaps in the shed wall. Nancy stood up, her joints popping, and wiped her palms on a rag. She walked to the driver's side door, the metal cold and damp under her touch. She slid into the seat, the upholstery smelling of stale dust and old leather. She reached for the key, her fingers steady, and turned it. The starter motor groaned, a slow, metallic whine that dragged through the morning air, but the engine did not catch. She let go, waited for the silence to settle, and tried again. The engine sputtered, coughed a cloud of black exhaust, and died. She did not panic. She stepped back out, popped the hood one last time, and adjusted the fuel intake valve with a sharp, decisive twist. She returned to the cabin, gripped the key, and pushed it forward. This time, the cylinders fired in a violent, rhythmic sequence. The engine roared to life, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the floorboards and shook the dust from the rafters. The noise tore through the morning stillness, drowning out the distant chirps of birds and the rustle of the wind. It was a mechanical scream of defiance. Nancy sat in the driver's seat, the vibration humming through her spine as the roar of the engine shattered the quiet of the graveyard and the isolation that had defined her entire life. The engine settled into a rhythmic, low-frequency hum that vibrated through the frame of the sedan. Nancy climbed out, her movements fluid despite the exhaustion pulling at her limbs. She stood by the open door, watching the man emerge from the cabin. He moved with a labored, deliberate pace, his hand pressing against his side as he steadied himself. He did not speak. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy object that caught the morning light with a dull, metallic glint. He stepped toward her, his gaze intense, and grabbed her hand. He pressed the coin into her palm, his fingers closing her grip around the cold, solid weight of the gold. It was heavy, biting into her skin, a tangible anchor in the swirling dust of the clearing. He held her gaze for a heartbeat, a silent recognition passing between them, before he turned away. He climbed into the driver's seat, the door clicking shut with a final heavy sound. The sedan lurched forward, tires spinning in the loose dirt. Nancy stood motionless, watching the vehicle accelerate down the road. The engine noise grew distant, then faded entirely, leaving behind only the settling dust. She remained in the center of the road, the silence of the cemetery returning to claim the clearing. But the air felt different now, charged with the sudden, sharp reality of the object she held. 3 days bled into one another, the silence of the cemetery returning to its usual suffocating weight. Nancy kept the gold coin tucked beneath a loose board in the floor, her life returning to the rhythm of scavenging and waiting. Then the horizon changed. A low, rhythmic thrumming began to vibrate through the dry earth, growing steadily until it became a mechanical roar. It was not the sound of a single engine, but a coordinated, heavy-duty pulse. A storm of red dust billowed over the crest of the hill. 4 black SUVs crested the rise in a tight, disciplined formation. They did not slow for the ruts in the road. They tore through the village, scattering chickens and forcing the few residents outside to scramble for cover. The vehicles maintained their speed until they reached the edge of the clearing, then braked in perfect unison. The screech of tires on gravel tore through the air. The convoy sat idling, their engines growling like trapped beasts, kicking up a thick, choking cloud of dust that swirled around the shed. Nancy stepped out into the haze. The lead man stepped forward, his boots crunching rhythmically against the dry, parched earth. He ignored the villagers who had gathered at the perimeter, their faces pale and eyes wide with suspicion. He stopped 3 paces from Nancy, his posture rigid and his expression unreadable. With a sharp, practiced motion, he pulled a rectangular box from beneath his arm. He flipped the latch, and the lid creaked open to reveal a deep, midnight blue velvet lining. Inside Inside lay a formal invitation, embossed with heavy gold lettering and a length of fine shimmering fabric. The man did not wait for her to speak. He explained that the patriarch had returned home and spoken to his son, declaring that he had found the only person with the necessary resolve to manage their vast shipping empire. The words hung in the air, cold and definitive. Nancy looked down at the box, her gaze tracing the intricate script on the paper. Nancy did not look at the villagers. She turned her back on their whispers and stepped into the dim, cramped interior of the shed one last time. The air smelled of damp earth and stale wood, a scent that had defined her existence since childhood. She walked to the corner where a small, worn rag doll lay on the packed dirt floor. Its fabric was frayed, the button eyes hanging by loose threads, a relic of a life spent in the shadows. She reached down, her fingers hovering over the rough material for a heartbeat, then pulled her hand away. She left it there in the dust. The lead man held the rear door of the SUV open. Nancy did not hesitate. She crossed the threshold onto the polished metal step. The interior was cool, smelling of leather and expensive oil. She sat on the edge of the seat, her spine straight. With a single firm movement, she pulled it shut. The latch clicked with a heavy final sound, sealing the past behind a wall of tinted glass. The lead driver engaged the transmission, and the heavy engine roared to life, vibrating through the frame of the vehicle. Outside, the villagers stood motionless, their faces frozen in a mix of disbelief and lingering resentment. The tires gripped the dry, cracked earth, spinning briefly before gaining traction. A thick cloud of red dust erupted from beneath the wheels. Nancy watched through the tinted glass as the cemetery and the village well shrank into small, indistinct shapes. The convoy accelerated, the distance between her and the life she had known widening. She did not look back. She had built this future with her own two hands, and as the last of the Springfield horizon vanished, she finally turned her eyes forward.